Easter Sunday, just after 200 in the afternoon. A school campus sits almost completely still, classrooms locked, hallways empty, no voices, no movement. Then, a sound, not loud, not sudden, just strange, like something heavy, being dragged slowly across the ground. It doesn't last long, a few seconds at most. And then, silence again. At the time, it didn't seem important. Just one of those small, forgettable moments you don't think twice about. But later, that sound would become one of the most chilling details in an entire investigation, because just hours before that, a 26-year-old teacher had walked onto those same school grounds, alive, happy, and only days away from getting married. Earlier that day, sometime around late morning, Stephanie Scott arrived at the school. It wasn't unusual. She had come in to prepare a few final things for her students before taking time off for her honeymoon. Her wedding was less than a week away. Everything in her life was moving forward exactly as she had planned. At 1:31 p.m., she turned off the classroom alarm. 7 minutes later, at 1:38, it was turned back on. That is the last confirmed moment Stephanie Scott was alive. After that, she vanished. No messages, no phone activity, no movement in her bank accounts. Nothing. Her car, gone. Her phone, switched off. It was as if she had simply disappeared. At first, there was no panic, no reason to assume anything was wrong, but as the hours passed, something began to feel off, because this wasn't like her, not even close. Stephanie Scott wasn't the type of person who just went silent. She was organized, the kind of person who always checked in, the kind of person people depended on, and more than anything, she was happy. Genuinely happy. She lived in a small rural town, the kind where everyone knows each other. The kind of place where life moves a little slower and people feel a little closer. That's where she had built her life, and that's where her story had begun. Stephanie and her fiancé Aaron had known each other for years, long before they ever became a couple. They grew up in the same town, went through the same circles, shared the kind of history that doesn't happen overnight. For a long time, they were just friends. Until one night changed everything. Aaron's 21st birthday, something shifted. What had always been friendship suddenly felt like something more, and from that point on, it only grew stronger. By 2015, they weren't just in love, they were building a future, a real one. They had a home, plans, and now, a wedding just days away. Stephanie had spent months preparing for it. Every detail mattered to her. She wasn't just excited, she wanted everything to be perfect. The venue was set. Guests had been invited. Her honeymoon was already booked. A trip she had been looking forward to for weeks. Even their first dance, they had been practicing it together, over and over again. Not because they had to, but because they wanted it to be special. Something they'd remember forever. To the people around her, Stephanie was easy to describe. Warm, kind, full of energy. The kind of person who smiled often and meant it. Her family had a nickname for her, Butternose. Something playful, something affectionate, the kind of nickname you only get when you're deeply loved, and in her career she brought that same energy into everything she did. Stephanie was a teacher, just like her father before her. She taught English and drama at the local high school, and she didn't treat it like just a job. She cared about her students, about her lessons, about doing things right. She put time into her work, effort into her planning. Her colleagues respected her. Her students connected with her. She wasn't just someone who showed up and left. She was someone who made an impact. Which is why what happened next felt so impossible to understand. Because just one day before she disappeared, Stephanie was still talking about her wedding, smiling, laughing, sharing details with her students. The dress, the plans, the excitement. There were no signs of stress, no signs of fear, no indication that anything in her life was wrong. If anything, she was exactly where she wanted to be. And that's what made it so unsettling. Because people don't just walk away from that, not days before their wedding, not without telling anyone, not without a trace. So when the silence stretched longer and longer and longer, that uneasy feeling began to turn into something else, something heavier, something harder to ignore. Because by the time the sun started to go down that evening, Stephanie still hadn't come home, and for the first time the thought crossed Aaron's mind that something might be very wrong. April 5th, 2015, Easter Sunday. For most people, it was a quiet day, a day for family, rest, maybe a break from routine. But for Stephanie, it was different. With her wedding just days away, she still had a few things left to finish. Small details. Things that probably didn't seem urgent to anyone else, but mattered to her. Late that morning, sometime around 11:00 a.m., Stephanie drove to the school. It wasn't a long trip, a place she had been to hundreds of times before. Familiar, routine, safe. She parked her car outside and met briefly with a colleague who lived nearby. Together, they opened the school gate. After that, Stephanie locked it behind her, keeping the keys with her. At the time, it was just another normal action. But later, that detail would matter. Inside the school, everything was quiet. No students, no classes, no noise echoing through the halls, just empty classrooms and still air. Stephanie made her way to the English staff room. She had work to finish. Plans to organize for the substitute teacher who would be covering her classes while she was away on her honeymoon. Even with everything going on in her life, she hadn't forgotten her responsibilities. While she was there, she sent an email. It was to a bus company confirming transportation arrangements for her wedding guests. It was a small detail, but it said a lot, making sure everything was exactly how she wanted it. At some point in the early afternoon, she began wrapping things up. At 1:31 p.m., the classroom alarm system was turned off. That meant someone was inside. 7 minutes later, at 1:38 p.m., it was turned back on, which suggested she was leaving. Or at least, that she was about to. And that's where the timeline ends. Because after 1:38 p.m., there are no confirmed sightings of Stephanie Scott. No messages. No calls. No activity. Nothing. Somewhere between finishing her work and walking out of that school, something happened. Meanwhile, Aaron wasn't worried. Not yet. He knew Stephanie was at the school. He knew she had things to take care of. And with the wedding so close, it made sense she'd be busy. The night before, and even earlier that morning, they had been texting. Everything was normal. She was replying quickly. Engaged in the conversation. Present. But as the day went on, her replies stopped. At first, it didn't feel alarming. People get busy. Phones die. Time slips by, but hours passed and still nothing. By the time evening came, that feeling started to change. Around 7:20 p.m., Aaron returned home. He expected to see her car outside, expected to walk in and find her there. Maybe tired, maybe still thinking about the wedding. But she wasn't there. Her car was gone. The house was empty, and suddenly, the silence felt different. He tried to stay calm, told himself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe she needed time alone. Maybe the stress of everything, the wedding, the planning, the emotions had caught up with her. Maybe she just needed space, but deep down, that didn't feel right. Because this wasn't like Stephanie, not even a little. From everything people had seen, she wasn't overwhelmed. She wasn't anxious. If anything, she was excited, looking forward to what was coming. Just the day before, she had been talking to her students about her dress, about the menu, about the plans. She was counting down the days. This wasn't someone running away from her life. This was someone stepping into it. That night, Aaron barely slept. He kept checking his phone, hoping for a message, a call, anything. Morning came, still nothing. He texted her again, called again, no response. At that point, the concern turned into something heavier, something harder to ignore. Because now, it had been over 24 hours, and no one had heard from her. That afternoon, around 4:30 p.m., Aaron made the decision, the one no one ever wants to make. He went to the police station and reported Stephanie missing. Once the report was filed, everything changed. What had started as quiet concern quickly turned into an active investigation. At first, police didn't immediately assume the worst. There was still a possibility that Stephanie had left the school grounds and something had happened afterward. An accident, maybe. A car off the road, a wrong turn, something unexpected, because her car was missing too, and that gave investigators a direction. Search teams were organized quickly. Officers began combing through the surrounding areas, roads, ditches, nearby fields. Helicopters were brought in to scan from above, looking for any sign of a vehicle, any sign of movement, anything that could explain where she had gone. At the same time, police focused on the last confirmed location, the high school. Easter Sunday had one unusual advantage. There weren't many people around, which meant fewer witnesses, but also fewer potential suspects, a smaller window, a more contained scene. Inside the school, investigators started piecing together her final moments. They checked the alarm system logs, and that gave them something solid. 1:31 p.m. alarm turned off. 1:38 p.m. alarm turned back on. That 7-minute window became critical. There was no activity on her bank accounts, no social media updates, nothing to suggest she had gone anywhere on her own. By April 7th, the search expanded beyond police. It moved into the public. Posts about her disappearance began spreading across social media, photos, descriptions, appeals for help. Within hours, people started sharing them. Hundreds, then thousands. In a small town, news travels fast. And soon, the entire community knew. Volunteers joined the search. Locals walked through open land, checking areas that hadn't yet been covered. Everyone hoping to find something, anything. But as time passed, hope slowly began to shift, because everything about this situation felt wrong. Stephanie wasn't someone who disappeared, not without telling anyone, not days before her wedding. Even her family felt it. That quiet, growing fear that something wasn't right. Her mother spoke publicly, trying to stay hopeful. But even through her words, you could hear the uncertainty. Investigators returned to the school again, this time with more focus, more precision. They began mapping out the area digitally, marking specific locations, reconstructing movements, trying to understand exactly what had happened that day. And that's when something changed. A witness came forward. Someone who had been near the school on Easter Sunday. He said that around 2000 p.m., not long after Stephanie was last confirmed to be there, he heard something unusual, a sound, like something being dragged across the ground. At the time, it didn't seem important. There was no reason to question it, but now it stood out, because the timing matched. Almost perfectly. The witness also remembered something else, a car. He had seen Stephanie's car parked under a covered walkway, but later it was gone. Detail added another layer. Because now, there were gaps in the timeline, moments that didn't fully connect. And then, another witness came forward. This one worked at the school. They described a conversation that had taken place the following morning. A conversation that, at the time, felt strange, but not alarming. Now it felt different. They had spoken to one of the school janitors, a 24-year-old man. They asked him if he had seen Stephanie that day. He said no, but when the conversation shifted when they mentioned the possibility that she might have run off due to pre-wedding nerves, he laughed. Not just a small reaction, not nervous, not awkward. A laugh that felt out of place. It didn't match the situation, didn't match the concern in the room, and there was something else. His face, he had visible scratches, marks that hadn't been there before. A detail that couldn't be ignored. The janitor's name was Vincent Stanford, and without anyone saying it out loud, the focus of the investigation began to shift. At this point in the investigation, Vincent Stanford wasn't being treated as a suspect, not yet. He was simply someone who had been there, someone who might have seen something. So detectives decided to speak with him, just a conversation, routine. Vincent told them he had gone to the school on Easter Sunday, even though he wasn't scheduled to work that day. According to him, it wasn't unusual. He said he had stopped by briefly, just to take out some trash. He claimed he wasn't there long. In fact, he said he left fairly quickly, because after that he had plans. He told police he went grocery shopping, simple, normal, nothing suspicious on the surface. He also said he hadn't seen Stephanie, didn't speak to her, didn't notice anything unusual, and as far as he was concerned, he couldn't help them. Before the conversation ended, he added something else. Good luck with the search. It was a small detail, but it stood out, because of how casual it sounded. Still, at that moment there wasn't enough to challenge him. Security cameras near the school showed his car leaving the area, sometime after 3:30 p.m. that seemed to line up with his version of events, at least, partially. But something didn't sit right. So police decided to verify the rest. They checked the store he claimed to have visited, the one he said he went to after leaving the school, and that's when things started to fall apart. The store was closed that day, completely closed, which meant there was no way he had gone there, no receipts, no witnesses, no proof of anything he had said. And suddenly, what seemed like a small, harmless detail became something much bigger, because people don't usually lie about things like that, not without a reason. That inconsistency changed everything. Vincent Stanford was no longer just someone who had been nearby. He became a person of interest. And with that shift, the tone of the investigation changed. Detectives brought him in again. This time, not for a casual conversation. This time, they were paying closer attention. Every answer, every pause, every detail. Meanwhile, they also started looking into his background, where he lived, who he lived with, what his routine looked like. Vincent was living at home with his mother. A normal enough situation on the surface. But now police needed more than surface-level information. They needed evidence, so they made a decision. They would go to his house, not because they had everything figured out, but because at this point, he was the only lead that wasn't fading, the only direction that hadn't gone cold. And what they were about to find there would take the investigation from suspicion to something far more serious. By now, the investigation had narrowed, leads were limited, time was passing, and pressure was building. Vincent Stanford had gone from a background figure to the center of attention, but suspicion alone wasn't enough. Detectives needed something solid, something real. So they went to his house. He lived there with his mother. A quiet, ordinary home, the kind that doesn't raise questions at first glance. When officers arrived, Vincent wasn't there, but his mother was. She allowed them inside. At that point, it still wasn't a full search warrant situation. More of a preliminary look. Attached to a red and white lanyard. It might not have meant much to anyone else, but to the investigators, it stood out immediately, because it matched the description of Stephanie's keys. The same keys she had used to lock the school gate. He pulled up outside, completely unaware of what was unfolding inside. The moment he stepped out of the car, everything changed again, because now his vehicle became part of the investigation. Police moved quickly, the car was secured, and a search began. Inside the trunk they found something else. MDF boards, flat panels, and on them a substance. Dark, dried, it looked like blood. At this point there was no ignoring what this could mean, but the discoveries didn't stop there. Outside the house, investigators noticed something unusual on the ground. Tire tracks, but not from Vincent's car. Different patterns, different impressions, which suggested something else had been there. Another vehicle, another movement, and then one more detail. A used condom. Discarded nearby. At first glance, it might have seemed unrelated, but investigators don't overlook details like that. Later, they would find the wrapper for it inside Vincent's bedroom. Piece by piece, a picture was forming, and it wasn't a good one. By now, Vincent was being questioned again, more directly, more seriously. When asked about his movements, he gave another explanation. He said he had been out taking photos. He pointed to a camera in his car, sitting on the front passenger seat. It was right there, within reach, like there was nothing to hide. But what was stored on that camera would change everything. The camera was right there, sitting on the passenger seat, within reach. It didn't look unusual, just an ordinary device, the kind anyone might carry around. But in that moment it became the most important object in the investigation. Detectives picked it up, turned it on, and started scrolling. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Then they reached the first set of images, and everything changed. The screen showed a body. A woman, lying on the ground in a wooded area, burned, severely damaged. Unmistakable, there was no confusion about what they were looking at. No room for interpretation. It wasn't staged, it wasn't fake, this was real, and in that instant the investigation shifted completely. Because those images told a story. One that no longer left space for doubt. Stephanie Scott hadn't disappeared. She had been killed. Right there next to them, the evidence was undeniable. The room changed. The atmosphere tightened. This was no longer a missing person case. This was murder. Vincent, standing nearby, tried to explain it. Something he had come across. Something he thought was funny. The substance in the car. And now these photos. It all connected. Step by step. Piece by piece. Until there was only one conclusion left. Vincent Stanford was no longer just a person of interest. He was the prime suspect. And within moments that suspicion turned into action. He was placed under arrest. Taken into custody in connection with Stephanie's disappearance and now her murder. But even then, there was one thing missing. Stephanie herself. Her body still hadn't been found, which meant the investigation wasn't over. Not even close, because now they had to answer the next question. Where was she? With Vincent now in custody, the investigation didn't slow down. If anything, it accelerated. Because even though police had a suspect, they were still missing something critical. Stephanie. And until they found her, there were still unanswered questions. So the search widened. Not just around the school anymore, but across the surrounding region. Fields, roads, remote areas, places where someone might try to hide something. Then, another discovery. Stephanie's car. It was found abandoned in a rural area several kilometers away from the school. Left there, alone. That raised even more questions, because now it was clear her car hadn't just disappeared. It had been moved, which meant someone else had driven it, and that someone was almost certainly Vincent. But the evidence didn't stop there. A few days into the investigation, another witness came forward. Someone who had seen something unusual on Easter Sunday, near a canal. According to him, sometime before 4:00 p.m., he noticed a vehicle parked nearby. A man stepped out, holding something. And then, without hesitation, he threw it into the water. The object wasn't small. It looked like a laptop. After that, the man got back into the car and drove away quickly. At the time, it didn't seem important, but now it changed everything. Police moved fast. Divers were brought in. The canal was searched. It didn't take long. They found it, a laptop, pulled from the water, damaged but still identifiable. It belonged to Stephanie, another piece, another confirmation. Someone had tried to destroy evidence, and with each new discovery the case became clearer. This wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. By now, the story had spread far beyond the town. Media coverage intensified. News crews arrived. Updates were broadcast daily. The small, quiet community was no longer quiet. People gathered, talked, speculated. And everywhere there was the same feeling. Shock. Because things like this weren't supposed to happen here. Not in a place like this. Not to someone like Stephanie. Meanwhile, the search for her body continued. Police focused on areas connected to Vincent, places he could have accessed. Places far enough away to go unnoticed. Every hour mattered, because time wasn't just passing, it was working against them. And then after days of searching, they found something. Something that would bring the search to an end. But not in the way anyone had hoped. Days had passed. Search teams had covered miles of land. Fields, roads, remote areas. Every possible location checked and rechecked. But until that moment, there was still a small space left for hope. The kind of hope people hold on to even when everything says otherwise. Roughly 60 kilometers away from the school, in a remote, wooded area, investigators found her. Stephanie Scott. Her body had been left there, hidden away, far from where anyone would think to look. And what they discovered next only made it worse. She had been brutally attacked. The injuries told the story. Multiple blows to the head, severe enough to cause fatal trauma. There were also wounds to her neck, and after that her body had been set on fire, an attempt to destroy evidence, to erase what had happened. Because even in that condition there was no doubt, it was Stephanie, and in that moment everything became real. The photos found on Vincent's camera were no longer just evidence. They were confirmation. He hadn't just been connected to the crime, he had documented it, captured it, kept it. The investigation had reached its answer, but that answer came with a cost, because now there was no uncertainty left. For her family, for Aaron, for everyone who knew her, this wasn't just the end of a search, it was the beginning of something far heavier. Grief, and the realization that nothing would ever be the same again. But even with the body found, there was still one question left, and the answer to that would be even more disturbing than anyone expected. With the discovery of Stephanie's body, the investigation reached a point where there was no longer any doubt about what had happened. But there was still something missing. The full story. And that story would come directly from Vincent himself. While in custody, he asked to speak with investigators. At that point, he didn't yet know that Stephanie's body had already been found, but he began talking anyway. What followed was a detailed confession, cold, direct, and deeply disturbing. He told them that on Easter Sunday, he had seen Stephanie inside the school. She was in the staff room, working, focused on her computer. He said he noticed her but didn't speak to her, didn't approach her, just saw her, and in that moment something changed. According to him, he felt an urge. Not anger, not frustration, just a sudden desire to kill. He couldn't explain it, didn't try to justify it. He simply said he wanted to do it. After seeing her, he left the school. But he didn't go home to relax, he didn't go about his day. Instead, he began preparing. He drove home and gathered items, things he thought he would need, handcuffs, a knife, cleaning supplies, he even brought medication. Then he got back into his car and returned to the school. At that point, Stephanie was finishing her work. She was getting ready to leave. As she walked past him, she made eye contact. She smiled and said something simple. "Have a nice Easter." A normal moment, a kind gesture, the kind of interaction you wouldn't even remember on any other day. But in this case, it became the last thing she ever said, because seconds later everything changed. Vincent said he grabbed her from behind, one hand over her mouth, the other holding her body. He dragged her away into a nearby storage room, closed the door, and forced her to the ground. She fought back. The scratches on his face came from her trying to defend herself, trying to escape, but it wasn't enough. He began attacking her, striking her repeatedly, using his fists, over and over and over again. He didn't stop. The violence was relentless, and in the end it was fatal. He had killed her, inside the school, in a place that was supposed to be safe. A sandwich, coffee, as if nothing had happened. As if there wasn't a body lying on the floor of that storage room. After eating, he returned to the school. He placed Stephanie's body into the trunk of her own car, wiping down surfaces, trying to erase what had happened. Once he was done, he drove her car to his house, and for a while he just left it there, parked outside, while he went inside and spoke to his family, like everything was normal. Later that night, or early the next morning, he made his final move. He drove out of town, to a remote area, far from the school, far from anyone who might see. One that showed just how calculated this had become. He poured fuel and set it on fire, an attempt to destroy evidence, to make identification harder, but before leaving he did something else. He took photos, images of the scene. Didn't stay, didn't watch, just walked away, as if it was over, as if it meant nothing. When investigators asked him why Stephanie, why, anyone, his answer was the same. There was no reason, no argument, no trigger, no explanation. He said he had violent thoughts before, about other people, but had never acted on them, until that day. And even then he didn't describe feeling anger. He didn't describe losing control. He just said he wanted to do it. And that was enough, was what made it even more disturbing. This wasn't personal. This wasn't planned around Stephanie. She was simply there. And that was enough. After the confession, the focus shifted. Not just on what happened but on who had done it, because what Vincent described didn't feel normal. There was no clear motive, no emotional trigger, no explanation that made sense. So investigators began digging deeper into his past, and what they found was disturbing, not because it explained everything but because it showed a pattern that had been building for years. Vincent Stanford had been born in Australia, but when he was very young his family moved overseas. They later returned, and he grew up in New South Wales. From an early age there were signs that something wasn't right. He told investigators that he had been thinking about killing someone since he was a child. Not as a passing thought. She told investigators that he had been thinking about coming in miters, in bot of the imagination, something that stayed with him. By the time he was a teenager, those thoughts hadn't gone away. If anything, they had become stronger. He described having violent urges, thoughts about harming people he encountered in everyday life, strangers, classmates, anyone. But according to him, he had never acted on those thoughts, until now. At school, his behavior had already raised concerns. He struggled socially, had difficulty forming connections. He didn't fit in, didn't build friendships the way others did. And over time, his behavior became more concerning. He was eventually placed in a specialized school, a program designed for children with behavioral issues. There, the problems became clearer. He showed signs of aggression, poor impulse control. At one point, he was even hospitalized in a youth psychiatric facility. Doctors diagnosed him with conditions that explained some of his behavior, including developmental and behavioral disorders. But those diagnoses didn't stop what was coming, because even as he got older, those underlying issues remained. He talked about feeling disconnected, said that he didn't experience emotions the way others did, that he had to learn how to feel. And even then, it didn't come naturally. As an adult, he struggled to find direction. He applied to join the military, was rejected, tried to pursue further education. That didn't work out either. He moved between jobs, short-term work, no stability. Eventually, he was hired as a cleaner at the same high school where Stephanie worked. At first, it was temporary, just a short contract. But it was extended, and that's where things became more concerning, because during his time at the school, his behavior didn't go unnoticed. He was often seen lingering near areas he didn't need to be, particularly around the girls' restrooms. It raised discomfort, but nothing that led to immediate action. And outside of work, his behavior was even more alarming. When investigators searched his phone and computer, they found thousands of images. Many of them were inappropriate, disturbing. Some involved underage girls. Others showed women who had no idea they were being watched, because he had been stalking people, following them, taking photos without their knowledge, documenting their routines, writing notes, in some cases detailed observations about when they were alone, where they went, how they moved. It wasn't random. It was systematic, calculated, and deeply unsettling. In fact, investigators later believed that Stephanie may not have even been his original target. There was evidence suggesting he had been focused on someone else, a younger girl connected to the school. He had tracked her movements, recorded details about her schedule, even noted times when she might be vulnerable. But for reasons unknown, that plan didn't happen, and instead his attention shifted to Stephanie. Forensic testing backed everything up. The substance found in his car was confirmed to be Stephanie's blood. More traces were found inside the vehicle, on objects in his home. Even items he had tried to clean still carried evidence. There was no doubt left, not about who did it. But what made it all so difficult to understand wasn't just the violence. It was the absence of emotion. Because throughout the investigation, throughout the confession, throughout everything, Vincent showed no real remorse, no visible regret. Witnesses described him as calm, detached, at times even indifferent, as if he was talking about something ordinary, something that didn't carry weight. And that, more than anything else, was what left people shaken, because it suggested something even more disturbing, that this wasn't just a single act, but something that had been building quietly over time. By the time the full truth came out, the entire town had changed. What was once a quiet, close-knit community was now carrying something heavy: shock, grief, disbelief. Because this wasn't just a story on the news anymore. This was someone they knew. A teacher, a friend, a daughter, someone who had been part of their everyday lives. And now she was gone. Because sometimes there are no words that make something like this easier. The school itself felt different. Classrooms that once held laughter and conversation now felt quiet. Because Stephanie hadn't just worked there, she had connected with people. She had made an impact, and that kind of presence doesn't just disappear without leaving a space behind. A memorial was organized. Hundreds of people came, then more. Eventually, nearly 1,000 gathered, all standing together, united by the same feeling: loss. Many wore yellow, Stephanie's favorite color, a color that once represented warmth, light, and happiness. Now it carried something more. A quiet tribute, a way of remembering who she was. People brought flowers, notes, messages. Some stood silently. Others held each other. There wasn't a single way to grieve, but everyone there felt it deeply. At one point, music began to play. A song that had been chosen for her wedding, the song she and Aaron were supposed to dance to, a moment that had been planned with excitement, with anticipation. Now it sounded different. Slower, heavier, like a goodbye instead of a beginning, and that contrast was almost unbearable, because everything about this moment was supposed to be something else, a celebration, a new chapter, a future. Instead, it had become an ending. Balloons were released into the sky, dozens of them, floating upward, a simple gesture, but in that moment it meant everything, like letting go, like sending something up because there was nowhere else for it to go. For Stephanie's family, the pain was overwhelming. Not just because of what had happened, but because of what had been taken. A wedding that would never happen. A future that would never unfold. Guests who had traveled from far away, now preparing for something no one had expected. A funeral, and the place that had been chosen for her wedding became the place where they said goodbye. That contrast between what should have been and what was something no one could ignore. It stayed with people. Because it wasn't just tragic, it felt wrong, like something that never should have happened. And as the community tried to process it, another development emerged, one that added a new layer to the case, something no one saw coming. Just as the case seemed clear, another development emerged, something no one had expected, because the investigation didn't end with Vincent. It extended further, to someone else, someone connected to him in the closest possible way, his twin brother, Marcus Stanford. Up until that point, Marcus hadn't been part of the public story. The focus had been entirely on Vincent, his actions, his confession, his past. But behind the scenes, investigators had uncovered something else. Evidence that didn't stay with Vincent, evidence that had been sent away to Marcus. Among the items Vincent had taken after the crime were personal belongings, things that belonged to Stephanie, her jewelry, her identification, items that carried both emotional value and investigative importance. Instead of discarding them or keeping them hidden, Vincent sent them to his brother. Marcus, who was living in another city at the time, received them, and instead of questioning it, instead of reporting it, he made a choice. He sold the jewelry, pawned it, and as for her identification, it was destroyed, thrown away, an attempt to erase it, to remove any connection, to make it disappear. When this came to light, it changed how people saw the case, because this was no longer just about one person. Now there was someone else involved, not in the act itself, but in what came after, helping to cover it up. Marcus was arrested, taken into custody, and for many this was another shock, because it raised new questions. How much did he know? When did he know it? And why didn't he come forward? The idea that someone could receive those items and not immediately report them was difficult for people to understand, especially given what they represented. For the community, it added another layer of anger, another layer of disbelief, because the case was already heavy enough, and now it felt even deeper, more complicated. Both brothers would face consequences, but not equally, and that difference would become a point of frustration for many, because for some justice didn't feel complete. Not yet. With both Vincent and Marcus in custody, the case moved into its next phase, the courtroom. This was where everything would be laid out, the evidence, the confession, the full weight of what had happened. But at first, there was still uncertainty. Because even after his arrest, Vincent didn't immediately plead guilty, and that created tension for investigators, for the prosecution, for Stephanie's family, because without a clear plea, there was a possibility of a long trial, one that would go over every detail, every moment, every piece of evidence in full public view, and that meant something else. It meant reliving everything, again and again. But as the case developed, the picture became clearer. The evidence was strong. Not just one piece, but a chain of facts, each one connecting to the next. The keys found in his house, the blood evidence in his car, the camera, the photos, the location of the body, and most importantly, his own confession. Together they formed a complete timeline, one that was difficult to challenge. At the same time, experts began evaluating Vincent. Psychological assessments were carried out, trying to understand his mental state, his behavior, his capacity for responsibility. The conclusions were unsettling. Specialists described him as someone with a deeply disturbed pattern of thinking, someone who lacked empathy, who didn't experience emotional responses the way most people do. There was no strong indication of remorse, no visible regret for what he had done. In interviews, he remained calm, detached, at times even indifferent, as if the crime he had committed didn't carry the weight it should have. Some experts went further. They suggested that without intervention, this might not have been the only crime, that his behavior showed signs of escalation, a pattern that could have continued. That detail alone was enough to send a chill through the courtroom, because it meant this wasn't just a single act of violence. It was something that had been building, something that might have happened again. Eventually, the uncertainty ended. Vincent made his decision. He pleaded guilty, one that removed any remaining doubt for Stephanie's family, It meant they wouldn't have to go through a full trial. They wouldn't have to hear every detail presented over and over again. They wouldn't have to sit through weeks or months of testimony. It didn't ease the pain, but it spared them from reliving it in the most public way possible. At the same time, Marcus's role was also addressed in court. He admitted to his involvement, acknowledged that he had received the items, that he had sold them, that he had destroyed evidence. And for that he would face his own sentence. But as those sentences were handed down, a divide began to form. Because while one outcome felt expected, the other didn't, and for many watching it didn't feel like justice was balanced. The courtroom was quiet, not silent but heavy, because everyone there knew this was the moment that would decide everything. For Stephanie's family, it wasn't about closure. Nothing could undo what had happened. Nothing could bring her back. About making sure the person responsible faced the consequences. Vincent stood before the court, calm, still. The same detached presence he had shown throughout the case, no visible emotion, no reaction, as if the moment didn't fully register. The judge began delivering the sentence, carefully, deliberately, detailing the crime, the lack of motive, and the danger he posed. For many in the courtroom it felt like the only possible outcome, a necessary one, but even then it didn't feel like enough, because some losses can't be measured in years. They can't be balanced by a sentence. As the decision settled in, attention turned to the other side of the case. Marcus, his involvement had been different. He hadn't committed the act, but he had helped cover it up, handled items that should have been evidence, destroyed things that mattered, and for that he was sentenced. But the sentence was far lighter, just over a year in prison, a fraction of what many had expected, and for the public that was difficult to accept. Because while his role wasn't the same, it still mattered. It still contributed to the aftermath, to the attempt to erase what had happened. And for many it felt like that hadn't been fully recognized. Frustration grew, not just in the courtroom but across the community, in conversations, online, in the quiet discussions between people trying to process everything. Because justice isn't just about the outcome. It's about how that outcome feels, and in this case it felt uneven. It was personal. Raw, real. She spoke about her daughter, about who she was, about what had been taken, the life that should have continued, the future that would never happen, and the pain that would never fully go away. There were no dramatic outbursts, no raised voices, just words. But those words carried more weight than anything else said that day, because they came from a place no one else in that room could truly understand. And when she finished, there was nothing left to add. The case was over, but the story wasn't. When the case finally came to an end, life didn't just go back to normal. It couldn't. Because something like this doesn't fade with time. It stays. In the places where it happened, for Stephanie's family, the loss was permanent. Not just the loss of her, but everything that came with her, the future they had imagined, the milestones they would never see, a wedding that should have been filled with joy, replaced by a funeral, a celebration of life turned into a goodbye. For Aaron, the impact was just as deep. The person he had planned to spend his life with, gone in a moment. The memories they had built together now carrying a different weight. The dance they had practiced, the honeymoon they had planned, all of it frozen in time. But even in the aftermath, there were changes. The school reviewed its safety policies, access procedures, staff presence, security measures. Steps were taken to make sure something like this would never happen again. Not in the same way, because sometimes change comes from the worst moments. Not because it should, but because it has to. The community continued to remember her. Not the crime, not the headlines, not the details that shocked everyone, but her life. The person she was before all of this. And that's how she's remembered, not as a victim, but as someone who brought something good into the world, someone who should have had more time. And maybe that's the hardest part of stories like this. Not just what happened, but what didn't get the chance to happen. The moments that were never lived, the future that was taken away. Because in the end, this wasn't just a crime story. It was a life interrupted. And a reminder of how quickly everything can change. So while the case is closed, and the verdict has been given, the impact of what happened is still there, still felt, and still remembered. Because some stories don't really end, they just become something people carry with them, quietly, over time. You are watching the dark bookcase.